Welcome to Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, New York. 478 acres of rolling hills, glacial ponds, and winding paths, all of it tucked between the neighborhoods of Park Slope and Sunset Park. Founded in 1838, Greenwood was one of the first rural cemeteries in America, and in its early decades it drew 500,000 visitors a year, second only to Niagara Falls as a tourist attraction. More than 570,000 people are buried here. Civil War generals and Gilded Age tycoons, inventors and artists, gangsters and governors. Today, we're going to visit 30 of them. Let's begin. Just past the magnificent Gothic Revival entrance gates, we make our way along a quiet path to find a man who, for millions of Americans, will always be the great and powerful Wizard of Oz. Frank Morgan, born Francis Philip Wupperman, right here in New York City in 1890, was one of the busiest character actors of Hollywood's golden age, appearing in more than 100 films over a career that stretched from the silent era into the late 1940s. His family had made a fortune distributing Angostura bitters, but young Frank followed his older brother Ralph into acting, making his Broadway debut in 1914. At MGM, he became the studio's go-to character man, courtly, befuddled, endlessly likable. You know him as the shopkeeper in the shop around the corner alongside Jimmy Stewart, and as the sympathetic telegraph operator in The Human Comedy. He earned 2 Academy Award nominations, one for Best Actor in The Affairs of Cellini, and another for Best Supporting Actor in Tortilla Flat. But it's that one picture from 1939 that made him immortal. In The Wizard of Oz, Morgan played not one, but 5 different roles: Professor Marvel, the gatekeeper, the carriage driver, the palace guard, and of course, the wizard himself. W.C. Fields was originally considered for the part, but after endless haggling over his fee, the studio gave it to Morgan. His co-star, Margaret Hamilton, who played the Wicked Witch, once said that the scene where the wizard hands out gifts from his black bag always made her cry because Frank Morgan was just like that in real life, very generous. There's an ironic footnote. Morgan never lived to see The Wizard of Oz become the beloved classic we know today. The film didn't turn a profit on its initial release, and its iconic status really took hold when CBS began broadcasting it annually in 1956, 7 years after Morgan's death. He passed away in his sleep from a heart attack in 1949, at the age of 59, while in the middle of filming Annie Get Your Gun. He was buried here under his family name, Wupperman. From the land of Oz, we step into far darker territory. Not far from the wizard rests a man whose name was once whispered with fear across New York City. Albert Anastasia was born Umberto Anastasio in the Calabria region of Italy in 1902. He arrived in New York as a teenager and quickly fell into the world of organized crime, rising through the ranks to become one of the most feared figures in the American Mafia. He co-founded and ran what the press called Murder Incorporated, the enforcement arm of the National Crime Syndicate, a group believed to have carried out hundreds of contract killings during the 1930s. By 1951, after his boss Vincent Mangano conveniently disappeared, Anastasia took control of what would become known as the Gambino crime family. His temper was legendary. So was his paranoia. He was charged with murder on multiple occasions, but witnesses had an eerie habit of disappearing or turning up dead before trial. On the morning of October 25, 1957, Anastasia walked into the barbershop at the Park Sheraton Hotel in Midtown Manhattan for a shave and a haircut. His bodyguard had stepped away. 2 masked gunmen walked in and opened fire. According to accounts, the disoriented Anastasia lunged at his attackers, but what he was actually charging at were their reflections in the barbershop mirror. He was 55 years old. The crime was never officially solved, though rival mobsters Vito Genovese and Carlo Gambino are widely believed to have orchestrated the hit. The barbershop is now a Starbucks. Anastasia's funeral was a small affair. The Brooklyn diocese refused to sanction a church burial. He was interred here at Greenwood under the family spelling, Anastasio. Let's leave the underworld behind and walk to a story that connects this cemetery directly to one of the most shocking moments in American history. Laura Keene was a British-born actress who became the first prominent female theater manager in New York, a remarkable achievement in mid-19th century America. Born Mary Frances Moss in Winchester, England, in 1826, she reinvented herself after a turbulent early life. Her first husband was convicted of a crime and shipped to an Australian penal colony, leaving her alone with 2 young daughters. She took the stage name Laura Keene, crossed the Atlantic, and built a theatrical empire. She produced and starred in plays, ran her own theater, and in 1858 debuted a comedy called Our American Cousin, which became a hit. That play would follow her into history. On the evening of April 14, 1865, Keene and her company were performing Our American Cousin at Ford's Theater in Washington, D.C. President Abraham Lincoln and his wife were in the audience. During the performance, John Wilkes Booth entered the presidential box and shot Lincoln. In the pandemonium that followed, Keene reportedly made her way to the box, where she cradled the dying president's head in her lap. Lincoln's blood stained the cuff of her dress. That blood-stained cuff was later donated to the National Museum of American History, where it remains today. Keene continued working for several more years, but her health had been declining. She died of tuberculosis in 1873 at the age of 47 and was laid to rest here at Greenwood. We continue along the path to meet a man whose invention quite literally changed how the world communicates. Samuel FB Morse is buried here at Greenwood, and while many people know his name from Morse code, fewer realize he started out as a painter, and a very good one. Born in Charlestown, Massachusetts in 1791, the son of a prominent Calvinist minister, Morse studied at Yale and then at the Royal Academy of Arts in London, where he trained in historical painting and portraiture. Back in America, he spent years as a respected artist, painting a famous portrait of the Marquis de Lafayette for the city of New York, and helping to found the National Academy of Design, where he served as the first president. But art didn't pay the bills the way he needed, and a personal tragedy planted the seed that would redirect his life entirely. In 1825, while Morse was away in Washington working on a painting, his young wife Lucretia fell gravely ill in New Haven. A letter was sent by Horace to inform him, but by the time it arrived and he rushed home, Lucretia had already been buried. He never got to say goodbye. That agonizing delay haunted him for the rest of his life. Morse became consumed with the idea of instantaneous long-distance communication. Working with collaborators and building on the ideas of other inventors, he developed the electric telegraph and the dot and dash code that bears his name. On May 24, 1844, seated in the chambers of the U.S. Supreme Court, he tapped out the first telegraphic message to his assistant in Baltimore. "What hath God wrought?" Within a few years, telegraph wires were strung across the continent, and news could travel at the speed of electricity instead of the speed of a horse. Morse grew wealthy, famous, and contentious, spending years in patent disputes with other inventors who claimed credit for the telegraph. He died in New York in 1872 of pneumonia, at the age of 80. From the age of the telegraph, we leap forward more than a century to one of the most dazzling and troubled artists of the 20th century. Jean-Michel Basquiat was born right here in Brooklyn in 1960 to a Haitian father and a mother of Puerto Rican descent. He dropped out of high school and first gained attention as a teenager, spray painting cryptic, poetic graffiti across Lower Manhattan under the tag SAMO, short for Same Old. By his early 20s, Basquiat had vaulted from the streets into the galleries, producing bold, frenetic paintings that fused text, imagery, African-American history, anatomy, and street culture into something entirely his own. He became a star of the downtown New York art scene of the early 1980s, collaborating with Andy Warhol and commanding enormous prices for his canvases while still in his mid-20s. Today, his paintings sell for staggering sums. In 2017, an untitled piece from 1982 sold at auction for over $110 million, making it one of the most expensive American artworks ever sold. But Basquiat struggled with heroin addiction throughout his rise, and the death of his friend and collaborator Andy Warhol in February 1987 devastated him. He spiraled. On August 12, 1988, Basquiat died of a heroin overdose at his studio in NoHo. He was 27 years old, the same age as Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison when they died. A grim coincidence that would later be called the 27 Club. He was buried here at Greenwood with a small family funeral. Visitors sometimes leave art supplies and handwritten notes at his grave. The contrast couldn't be sharper as we turn our attention from a man who lived fast and died young to a man who built something meant to last forever. Heinrich Engelhard Steinway was born in Germany in 1797, in a time of war and hardship. His family was killed in a fire set by Napoleon's retreating army, and young Heinrich survived alone, eventually learning the craft of instrument making. He built his first piano in his kitchen. In 1850, he emigrated to the United States with his family, anglicized his name to Henry Steinway, and in 1853 founded Steinway & Sons in Manhattan. Within a decade, Steinway pianos were winning international prizes and becoming the instrument of choice for the world's greatest performers. Henry Steinway understood that a great piano wasn't just about craftsmanship, it was about science. His sons patented dozens of innovations in string tension, soundboard design, and iron framing. By the time Henry died in 1871 at the age of 73, the Steinway name was synonymous with excellence. His son William continued the legacy, even building a company town in Queens, Steinway Village, for the factory workers. Henry and several members of his family rest here at Greenwood, their names still printed on concert stages around the world. Let's cross over to a section of the cemetery where the permanent residents are of a different sort entirely. Not artists or inventors, but men who wielded raw power. William Magyar Tweed, better known as Boss Tweed, ran New York City like a personal fiefdom in the 1860s and 70s. As the head of Tammany Hall, the Democratic political machine, Tweed controlled city politics at every level: judges, aldermen, contractors, even the police. Through kickbacks, fraudulent contracts, and brazen graft, Tweed and his associates are estimated to have stolen somewhere around $200 million from the city, an amount equivalent to several billion today. The racket was simple in principle. Any company doing business with the city had to inflate its bills, sometimes by 200 or 300%, and kick the excess back to the Tweed ring. He served in Congress, in the state Senate, and on the county board of supervisors. But his real power was unofficial. It flowed from his ability to deliver votes, jobs, and contracts. Tweed's downfall began when a disgruntled insider leaked financial records to the New York Times, and political cartoonist Thomas Nast started skewering him in the pages of Harper's Weekly. Nast's caricatures of the corpulent boss, Tweed reportedly weighed close to 300 pounds, were devastating. Tweed is said to have complained that his constituents couldn't read, but they could certainly understand those pictures. He was convicted on corruption charges in 1873, escaped from jail in 1875, fled to Spain, where, the story goes, he was recognized from a Nast cartoon, was recaptured, and returned to New York. He died in the Ludlow Street Jail in 1878 at the age of 55. Greenwood's rules at the time prohibited burying anyone who had died in jail, but Tweed's family managed to secure him a plot here nonetheless. A short stroll brings us to a man who never sought fame, but whose invention sits in closets and sewing rooms around the world to this day. Elias Howe Jr. was born in Spencer, Massachusetts in 1819 and grew up working in his father's mill. Fascinated by machinery, he apprenticed in a Boston machine shop, where he overheard someone remark that a fortune awaited whoever could build a practical sewing machine. Howe spent years tinkering, and in 1846 he patented a design that used a lock-stitch mechanism with a needle that had the eye at its point, a breakthrough that made machine sewing practical. But getting rich from it was another matter. He sailed to England to find backers, failed, and returned to America nearly penniless, only to discover that other manufacturers, most notably Isaac Singer, were building sewing machines based on his design. Howe fought a series of bitter patent lawsuits and eventually won, earning royalties on every sewing machine sold in the United States. By the time of the Civil War, Howe had become wealthy. He even enlisted as a private in a Connecticut infantry regiment, reportedly funding the regiment's equipment out of his own pocket. Howe died in 1867 at just 48 of kidney failure, only days after the expiration of his patent. The man who made home sewing possible for millions rests here at Greenwood. Now for a story that has nothing to do with needles and thread and everything to do with scandal, seduction, and sheer audacity. Lola Montez was born Eliza Rosanna Gilbert in Ireland in 1821, the daughter of a British Army officer. By her 20s, she had reinvented herself as a Spanish dancer named Lola Montez, touring Europe with a fiery stage act and a gift for captivating, powerful men. Her list of alleged lovers reads like a 19th century gossip column: Franz Liszt, Alexandre Dumas, and most famously, King Ludwig I of Bavaria. Ludwig was so smitten with Montez that he made her a countess and essentially allowed her to influence Bavarian politics. The scandal was so great that it contributed to Ludwig's abdication in 1848. Montez eventually came to America, performed on stages from New York to San Francisco and the Australian goldfields, and tried to reinvent herself yet again as a lecturer on beauty and self-improvement. By the late 1850s, though, her health and fortune had both faded. She settled in New York, turned to charity work, and died of pneumonia in 1861 at the age of 39. She was buried here at Greenwood under her birth name, Eliza Gilbert. From a woman who shook thrones, we turn to a man who shook the conscience of a nation. Henry Ward Beecher was one of the most famous Americans of the 19th century, a preacher, orator, and abolitionist whose Sunday sermons at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn Heights were so popular that ferries from Manhattan were nicknamed Beecher boats for the crowds they carried across the East River to hear him speak. Beecher was a passionate opponent of slavery. In the years before the Civil War, he staged mock slave auctions from his pulpit to raise money to purchase enslaved people's freedom. He also helped funnel rifles to anti-slavery settlers in Kansas. The crates were sometimes labeled Bibles to avoid detection, and the weapons became known as Beecher's Bibles. He was the brother of Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose novel Uncle Tom's Cabin became the most influential anti-slavery text in American history. When Abraham Lincoln met Harriet, he reportedly said, "So you're the little woman who wrote the book that started this great war." Henry Ward Beecher was also engulfed in one of the most sensational scandals of the era. In the 1870s, he was accused by his friend and fellow reformer Theodore Tilton of having an affair with Tilton's wife, Elizabeth. The resulting trial in 1875 lasted 6 months, drew national headlines, and ended in a hung jury. Beecher denied the charges, kept his pulpit, and remained enormously popular until his death from a cerebral hemorrhage in 1887 at the age of 73. Speaking of Brooklyn institutions, our next stop honors a man whose name is forever linked to one of the most beloved ballparks in American history. Charles Hercules Ebbets, yes, Hercules was really his middle name, started working for the Brooklyn Baseball Club as a young man in the 1880s, selling tickets and scorecards. He couldn't afford to buy his way in, so he earned his way in, working his way up through the front office over 2 decades until he became the team's majority owner. In 1913, he built Ebbets Field in the Flatbush neighborhood, a cozy jewel of a ballpark that held just over 30,000 fans, with seats so close to the field you could hear the players arguing with the umpire. Ebbets Field became the home of the Brooklyn Dodgers for more than 4 decades, and within those walls, some of baseball's greatest moments unfolded. It's where Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier in 1947, where the Dodgers won their first and only World Series as a Brooklyn team in 1955, finally beating those damn Yankees, and where Vin Scully began his broadcasting career. Ebbets didn't live to see any of that. He died of heart failure in 1925 at the age of 65 and was laid to rest here at Greenwood. The ballpark that bore his name was demolished in 1960, replaced by an apartment complex, but its legend endures. We'll meet another early baseball figure later on our tour, one whose story is even more surprising. From the crack of the bat to the shimmer of colored glass. Nearby, we find the resting place of Louis Comfort Tiffany, one of the most celebrated decorative artists in American history. If you've ever stood in a church or a museum and been stopped in your tracks by a stained glass window alive with color, deep blues, fiery reds, iridescent greens layered and blended in ways that seem to glow from within, there's a good chance you were looking at a Tiffany window. Louis was the son of Charles Louis Tiffany, founder of the famous jewelry store on Fifth Avenue, but he carved out his own legacy entirely. Born in New York in 1848, he trained as a painter under George Inness and traveled extensively in Europe and North Africa, where the colors of Moorish architecture and medieval stained glass made a deep impression. He turned his attention to the decorative arts, particularly glassmaking, and developed a technique for creating what he called Favral glass, an iridescent art glass that could be shaped into lamps, vases, and windows of extraordinary beauty. His lamps, with their elaborate shades depicting dragonflies, wisteria, poppies, and peonies, became some of the most coveted objects in American decorative art. Tiffany Studios produced thousands of these lamps, and every one was handmade. He also designed interiors for some of the most prestigious addresses in the country: Mark Twain's house in Hartford, the White House under President Chester Arthur, and churches and mansions from coast to coast. Tiffany lived to be 84, dying in 1933, long enough to see Art Nouveau fall out of fashion and his own work dismissed as old-fashioned. The world took decades to catch up. Today, a single Tiffany lamp can sell for millions at auction, and his windows are considered national treasures. We take a sharp turn now, from beauty to blood. Joey Gallo, known as Crazy Joe, was a Brooklyn-born mobster who shook up the New York Mafia in ways the old guard never expected. Born in 1929 in Red Hook, not far from this very cemetery, Gallo came up through the Profazzi crime family and quickly earned a reputation as unpredictable and fearless. It was Gallo who reportedly bragged about his crew's role in the murder of Albert Anastasia, the mobster we visited earlier today, calling his group the Barbershop Quintet. He and his brothers led a rebellion against the Profazzi family's leadership in the early 1960s, sparking a gang war that made headlines across the city. Gallo served nearly a decade in prison at Attica, and when he got out in 1971, he had reinvented himself as something of a counter-cultural figure, reading Camus and Sartre, socializing with writers and entertainers in Greenwich Village. He befriended the actor Jerry Orbach, and Bob Dylan later wrote a ballad about him called Joey. But the mob hadn't forgotten, and old scores have a way of being settled. On April 7, 1972, Gallo was celebrating his 43rd birthday with friends and family at Umberto's Clam House in Little Italy when a lone gunman walked in and opened fire. Gallo was hit multiple times, staggered through the restaurant and out to the street, where he collapsed and died. He was 43. His killing at Umberto's became one of the most notorious mob hits in New York history. He's buried here at Greenwood, the second gangster on our tour today, joining Anastasia in this rather exclusive Brooklyn neighborhood. After that violence, let's visit a man whose life was devoted to building things up rather than tearing them down. Peter Cooper was one of the most remarkable Americans of the 19th century. Inventor, industrialist, and philanthropist. A man with almost no formal schooling who changed the country in ways that are still felt today. Born in New York in 1791, Cooper was apprenticed to a coachmaker as a boy and had less than a year of formal education in his entire life. But he had an inventor's restless mind and a businessman's instinct. He designed and built the Tom Thumb, one of the first steam locomotives in America, in 1830, a tiny engine that proved railroad travel was commercially viable. He manufactured glue, gelatin, iron, and steel, and his Trenton Iron Works produced the structural iron beams used to build the dome of the U.S. Capitol. He also laid the first transatlantic telegraph cable across the Atlantic Ocean, connecting the invention of our earlier subject, Samuel Morse, to the wider world. But Cooper is best remembered for what he did with his fortune. In 1859, he founded Cooper Union for the Advancement of Science and Art, a college in Manhattan that offered free education to working-class New Yorkers regardless of race, religion, or gender, decades before such openness was common anywhere. Abraham Lincoln delivered his famous Cooper Union Address there in February 1860, a speech that many historians credit with establishing him as a serious presidential candidate and helping him win the White House. Cooper even ran for president himself in 1876 on the Greenback Party ticket at the age of 85. He received about 1% of the vote, but he didn't seem to mind. He died in 1883 at 92. Cooper Union still stands in the East Village, a living monument to the man buried here. Just a short distance away lies one of the most poignant stories in all of Greenwood. Charlotte Canda was a 17-year-old French-born debutante living in New York, beloved by her family and admired for her artistic talent. On the evening of February 3rd, 1845, her 17th birthday, she attended a party and was returning home by carriage when something went wrong. Accounts differ on the exact details, but she fell or was thrown from the carriage and died from her injuries that very night. Her grief-stricken family commissioned an elaborate memorial from the designs Charlotte herself had been sketching. Her monument became one of the most visited graves in Greenwood during the cemetery's early years as a tourist attraction, drawing thousands who came to see the ornate tribute to a young life cut short. Adding to the tragedy, the architect who designed the monument, Charles Gandolfo, reportedly fell to his death from the structure during its construction. He was just 17 himself. Charlotte Canda's story is a reminder that Greenwood isn't only about the famous. Sometimes the most affecting graves belong to those who simply died too young. We move on now to a man who told Americans exactly where they should go, and they listened. Horace Greeley was the founder and editor of the New York Tribune, one of the most influential newspapers in 19th century America. Born on a small farm in New Hampshire in 1811, Greeley arrived in New York as a young man with $10 in his pocket and a head full of opinions. He launched the Tribune in 1841 and built it into a national paper with a circulation that stretched far beyond New York, championing causes from abolitionism to labor rights to westward expansion. He is widely credited with the phrase, "Go West, young man," though historians debate whether he actually coined it or simply popularized it. As an employer, Greeley was notably progressive. He hired both Margaret Fuller, one of the first female journalists at a major paper, and Karl Marx as a European correspondent. Greeley wielded enormous political influence, helping to found the Republican Party and shaping public opinion on the great issues of the day. In 1872, he made the fateful decision to run for president against Ulysses S. Grant on the liberal Republican and Democratic tickets. He lost in a landslide, but the campaign had already destroyed him before the votes were counted. His wife, Mary, had died just days before the election after a long illness. The combined blow of personal loss and devastating political humiliation left Greeley shattered. Within weeks, he was committed to a sanitarium where he died on November 29, 1872, less than a month after the election. He was 61. His funeral at the Church of the Divine Paternity in New York drew thousands of mourners, including President Grant himself, the man who had just defeated him. Our next stop is among the oldest and most unusual graves in the cemetery. Do Hum Mi was a young woman of the Sauk people, the daughter of a chief. She was brought to New York around 1843, likely as a performer at P.T. Barnum's American Museum, where indigenous people were frequently put on display for paying audiences, a practice we would rightly condemn today. Do Hum Mi died in New York in 1843, probably still a teenager. She was buried here at Greenwood. Her story is a sobering reminder of the exploitation that so-called entertainment once inflicted on Native Americans and other marginalized people. She lies far from her homeland, in a cemetery she never chose, among people she never knew. Her presence here complicates the story of Greenwood, and that's exactly why she belongs on this tour. From a voice that was silenced too early, we come to a man who gave voice to millions. James Weldon Johnson was an author, educator, lawyer, diplomat, songwriter, and civil rights leader, one of the most accomplished Americans of the early 20th century. Born in Jacksonville, Florida in 1871, Johnson excelled at seemingly everything he attempted. He was the first black man admitted to the Florida bar after the Civil War, served as a U.S. consul in Venezuela and Nicaragua, and became the first black executive secretary of the NAACP, leading the organization through the 1920s. As a writer, he authored the novel The Autobiography of an Ex-Colored Man and edited influential anthologies of black poetry and spirituals. But his most enduring creation may be the song Lift Every Voice and Sing, written with his brother J. Rosamond Johnson in 1900, which became so important to the African American community that it came to be known as the Black National Anthem. Johnson died in a car accident in 1938, at the age of 67, when the car his wife was driving was struck by a train in Wiscasset, Maine. He is buried here at Greenwood, alongside his wife, Grace Nail Johnson. Our walk now brings us to a man who might not be a household name himself, but whose grandson certainly is. Leonard Jerome was a 19th century New York financier, horse racing enthusiast, and bon vivant. Born in 1817 in upstate New York, he made a fortune on Wall Street, lost most of it, made another one, and spent lavishly along the way. He was instrumental in developing thoroughbred horse racing in America and helped build Jerome Park Racetrack in the Bronx, the precursor to Belmont Park. Jerome was a founder of the American Jockey Club and a patron of the arts, known for throwing extravagant parties. But the reason his name echoes through history is his daughter, Jenny. In 1874, Jenny Jerome married Lord Randolph Churchill, a British politician. Their son, born in 1874, was named Winston. Winston Churchill, the man who would lead Britain through its darkest hour, was one quarter Brooklyn, thanks to his grandfather buried right here. Jerome died in 1891 at 73. Continuing our walk, we arrive at the grave of a man whose words you've almost certainly sung, even if you've never heard his name. Fred Ebb was one of the great Broadway lyricists of the 20th century. Partnered with composer John Canda for nearly 40 years, Ebb wrote the words to some of the most memorable songs in the history of musical theater. If you've ever belted out New York, New York, yes, the one Frank Sinatra turned into an anthem, you've sung a Fred Ebb lyric. That song was originally written for Liza Minnelli for the Martin Scorsese film of the same name, and Sinatra's version came later. Canda and Ebb created Cabaret, which won the Tony Award for Best Musical in 1967 and became an Oscar-winning film in 1972 starring Minnelli and Joel Grey. They wrote Chicago, which flopped on its initial Broadway run but was revived in 1996 and became the longest-running American musical in Broadway history. They also created Kiss of the Spider-Woman, Zorba, and The Rink. Ebb had a special working relationship with Liza Minnelli that spanned decades. He wrote much of her concert material and helped shape her persona as a performer. He was a consummate New Yorker, witty, sharp, sometimes acerbic, deeply devoted to the craft of lyric writing. Ebb died of a heart attack in 2004 at the age of 76. Canda continued composing, but he later said that losing Fred was like losing a part of himself. From the bright lights of Broadway, we descend into one of the rougher chapters of New York's past. William Poole, known to history as Bill the Butcher, was a bare-knuckle boxer, gang leader, and political enforcer in mid-19th century New York. Born in 1821, Poole earned his nickname working in the meatpacking trade, but his real business was violence. He was a leader of the Bowery Boys, an anti-immigrant gang aligned with the nativist Know-Nothing political movement, and he terrorized the streets of Lower Manhattan during the turbulent 1840s and 50s. In the 2002 Martin Scorsese film Gangs of New York, Daniel Day-Lewis played a character inspired by Poole, though the film took considerable liberties with history. The real Bill the Butcher was shot in a saloon brawl in 1855 and lingered for nearly 2 weeks before dying at the age of 33. His reported last words, "Goodbye, boys, I die a true American," became a rallying cry for the nativist cause. For many years, his grave here was unmarked, but a headstone was placed in 2004. Let's step back to more respectable company. DeWitt Clinton was a towering figure in New York politics during the early 19th century, serving as a U.S. Senator, Mayor of New York City, and twice as Governor of New York. But his greatest legacy is a ditch, a very long ditch. Clinton was the driving force behind the construction of the Erie Canal, the 363-mile waterway connecting the Great Lakes to the Hudson River, and by extension, to the Atlantic Ocean. The project was audacious. Critics called it Clinton's Ditch and Clinton's Folly. When the canal finally opened in 1825, Clinton himself poured a barrel of Lake Erie water into New York Harbor to symbolize the wetting of the waters. The canal slashed shipping costs by 90% and transformed New York City into the commercial capital of the nation, fueling the very prosperity that built the fortunes of men like Peter Cooper and Leonard Jerome, whom we've already visited on this tour. Clinton died in office in 1828 at the age of 58 of a sudden heart attack. He was originally buried in Albany, but in 1844, his remains were moved to Greenwood to help attract visitors and establish the cemetery's prestige. It worked beautifully. Clinton's reinterment put Greenwood on the map and helped make it the most fashionable burial ground in America. Not far from the governor who reshaped New York's economy rests a woman who broke barriers in an entirely different arena. Susan Smith McKinney Stewart was born in Brooklyn in 1847. The seventh of 10 children in a prosperous African-American family. Inspired in part by the deaths of two of her brothers during the Civil War, she decided to pursue medicine, a radical choice for any woman in the 1860s, and an almost unheard-of one for a black woman. In 1870, she graduated from the New York Medical College for Women as valedictorian, becoming the first black woman to earn a medical degree in the state of New York, and only the third in the entire country. She opened a practice in Brooklyn that served patients of all races and backgrounds at a time when most of the medical profession was closed to women and especially to black women. Dr. McKinney Stewart was also an accomplished organist who played at Bridge Street African Methodist Episcopal Church, and she co-founded the Brooklyn Women's Homeopathic Hospital and Dispensary. She later married Theophilus Stewart, an Army chaplain, and moved with him to Wilberforce, Ohio, and then to Montana. But she continued to practice medicine and advocate for public health throughout her life. Webb Du Bois eulogized her after she died in 1918 at the age of 70. She was brought back to Brooklyn for burial here at Greenwood. In 1974, a Brooklyn junior high school was renamed the Dr. Susan Smith McKinney Junior High in her honor. From a pioneer of medicine to a pioneer of the skies, Juan Trippe was born in Seabright, New Jersey in 1899, and from a young age he was obsessed with aviation. He learned to fly during World War I, and after the war he founded a small airline that would grow into one of the most famous companies in the history of air travel, Pan American World Airways. Under Trippe's leadership, Pan Am became America's flagship international airline, opening routes across the Pacific, the Atlantic, and to South America. Trippe was instrumental in developing the Boeing 707 jetliner, which ushered in the jet age of commercial aviation in the late 1950s, and he later pushed Boeing to build the 747, the jumbo jet that made international air travel affordable for ordinary people. Pan Am's Blue Globe logo was once one of the most recognized symbols in the world. Trippe ran the airline from 1927 to 1968 and lived to see it soar and begin to struggle. Pan Am would eventually go bankrupt in 1991, but its legacy as the airline that shrank the world endures. Trippe died in 1981 at the age of 81. After all that high-flying ambition, let's come back down to earth and to lunch. Charles Feltman is one of those people whose name should be far more famous than it is, considering what he contributed to American culture. A German immigrant who arrived in Brooklyn in the 1850s, Feltman is widely credited as the first person to serve a sausage on a long bread roll. In other words, the hot dog on a bun as we know it. In the 1860s, Feltman had a pie cart near the Coney Island shore. As the story goes, his customers wanted hot sandwiches, but his cart was too small for a full kitchen. His solution was elegant. He had a local baker create elongated rolls, put a hot frankfurter inside, and sold them for $0.10 apiece. It was an instant hit. By By the 1890s, Feltman had expanded his modest cart into a sprawling Coney Island restaurant complex, Feltman's Ocean Pavilion, that could seat thousands, employed over 1,000 waiters, and served millions of hot dogs a year. It was the largest restaurant in the world at the time. Here's the twist. One of Feltman's young employees, a Polish immigrant named Nathan Handwerker, thought his boss was charging too much. Nathan quit and opened his own competing hot dog stand nearby, undercutting Feltman's price. That stand became Nathan's Famous, which still operates at Coney Island today and hosts the annual 4th of July hot dog eating contest. Feltman died in 1910 at the age of 69. He made the American hot dog, and his former employee made a fortune from it. From a man who fed people to a man who protected creatures that couldn't protect themselves. Henry Bergh was born into a wealthy New York family in 1818 and spent his early years living comfortably as a gentleman and diplomat. While serving as a diplomatic attaché in Russia, he witnessed the brutal treatment of horses and working animals, and it changed his life. Upon returning to New York, Bergh threw himself into the cause of animal welfare. In 1866, he founded the American Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, the ASPCA, the first organization of its kind in the Americas. He personally patrolled the streets of New York, confronting drivers who whipped their horses, shutting down dogfighting rings, and pushing for laws to protect animals. He was sometimes mocked for his efforts. Newspapers called him the Great Meddler, but he persisted. Bergh also played a role in the founding of the first child protective services organizations, recognizing that the legal frameworks he had built for animals could be extended to protect abused children. He died in 1888 at the age of 70. The ASPCA he created remains one of the most prominent animal welfare organizations in the world. We now visit one of the most fascinating and unlikely stories in baseball history, and the earliest baseball figure on our tour, whom we promised you when we visited Charles Ebbets earlier. James Creighton Jr. was born in New York in 1841 and is considered one of the first true stars of organized baseball, and quite possibly the first pitcher to throw what we'd now call a fastball. In the late 1850s and early 1860s, the rules of baseball were still being written, and they were very different from what we know today. Pitchers were supposed to throw underhand, essentially lobbing the ball to the batter. Creighton figured out a way to snap his wrist at the point of release, adding speed and spin that made his deliveries nearly unhittable, a technique the rule-makers hadn't anticipated and didn't quite know what to do about. Playing for the Brooklyn Excelsiors, he became a sensation, drawing huge crowds and leading his team on a barnstorming tour through upstate New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore that helped popularize the game far beyond the city. He was, in many ways, baseball's first celebrity athlete. But on October 14, 1862, during a game against the Morrisania Unions, Creighton swung the bat hard, felt something snap inside him, and collapsed. He was carried home but died 4 days later, likely from a ruptured bladder or internal abdominal injury. He was just 21 years old. His heartbroken teammates honored him with a memorial here at Greenwood, one of the earliest baseball monuments in the country. If you think about it, the line runs straight from this young man's grave to Ebbets Field, and from Ebbets Field to Dodger Stadium. The game he helped create and the borough he played in became inseparable. From the playing fields of early American sport, we step back to the very founding of the nation itself. William Livingston was born in 1723 in Albany, New York, into one of the most powerful families in colonial America. The Livingstons owned vast estates along the Hudson River and wielded political influence for generations. William studied law at Yale, became a prominent attorney and essayist, and was a vocal critic of British colonial policy in the years leading to the Revolution. When war came, Livingston moved to New Jersey, served as a brigadier general of the New Jersey militia, and was elected the first governor of the state of New Jersey in 1776, a position he held for 14 consecutive years, through the entire war and beyond. The British wanted him badly. They sent multiple raiding parties to capture or kill him at his home, which he called Liberty Hall, and Livingston narrowly escaped each time. In 1787, at the age of 63, he served as one of New Jersey's delegates to the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, and he signed the United States Constitution. Only 39 men affixed their names to that document. Livingston died in 1790 at the age of 66. His remains were eventually moved to Greenwood. Among the more than 500,000 people buried in this cemetery, he may be the one with the most direct connection to the founding of the American Republic. And so we come to our final stop, and it is a fitting one. Near the summit of Battle Hill, the highest natural point in Brooklyn, where Continental soldiers fought the British in the Battle of Long Island during the Revolutionary War, rests Leonard Bernstein. If you love music, if you love theater, if you've ever watched West Side Story and felt your heart race during the dance at the gym, or been brought to tears by Somewhere, then you've been moved by the work of this man. Bernstein was born in Lawrence, Massachusetts, in 1918, the son of Ukrainian Jewish immigrants. His father, a beauty supply businessman, was skeptical of a career in music. "How do you make a living from music?" the elder Bernstein famously asked. His son spent a lifetime answering that question. Young Leonard studied at Harvard and at the Curtis Institute of Music, and in 1943, at the age of 25, he got the break that changed everything. When guest conductor Bruno Walter fell ill, the unknown assistant conductor Leonard Bernstein stepped in to lead the New York Philharmonic, with no rehearsal. The concert was broadcast nationally on CBS radio, and the next morning Bernstein was on the front page of the New York Times. A star was born. From that improbable beginning, Bernstein became the most famous American conductor of the 20th century. In 1958, he was named music director of the New York Philharmonic, the first American-born conductor to hold that position. His Young People's Concerts, broadcast on CBS television, introduced a generation of children to classical music with a warmth and enthusiasm that made even the most complex symphonies feel accessible. As a composer, his range was breathtaking. He wrote the score for the ballet Fancy Free, the Broadway musicals On the Town and Wonderful Town, the operetta Candide, the film score for On the Waterfront, and, of course, West Side Story, his masterpiece, with lyrics by the young Stephen Sondheim. West Side Story opened on Broadway in 1957 and redefined what a musical could be, fusing jazz, Latin rhythms, and classical music into something entirely new. Bernstein was also a man of deep feeling and sometimes contradictory impulses. A passionate advocate for social justice who threw a controversial fundraiser for the Black Panthers. A married father of 3 who also had relationships with men throughout his life. His wife, the Chilean-born actress Felicia Montealegre, died of lung cancer in 1978. In his later years, Bernstein conducted all over the world. On Christmas Day, 1989, he led a performance of Beethoven's Ninth Symphony in Berlin to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall, one of the great cultural moments of the 20th century. Less than a year later, Bernstein announced his retirement from conducting. He died 5 days after that announcement, on October 14, 1990, of a heart attack brought on by mesothelioma. He was 72. On the day of his funeral procession through the streets of Manhattan, construction workers along the route removed their hard hats and waved, calling out, "Goodbye, Lenny." He was buried here next to Felicia with a copy of the score of Mahler's Fifth Symphony placed over his heart. And so our walk through Greenwood comes to an end. We've covered a lot of ground: inventors and mobsters, presidents and painters, a wizard and a butcher, a conductor and a hot dog man. 478 acres of American history, all of it here in Brooklyn. Thanks for coming along.